African leaders are making strides to fund conflict resolution on the continent. The African Union has relaunched its Peace Fund at an event in Addis Ababa, attended by current and former heads of state. The fund aims to prevent and manage conflict as well as find African solutions to African problems. In 2015, the African Union decided to self-finance 25% of its peace and security activities. The Peace Fund aims to be worth $400 million by 2021. However, only $60 million has been collected so far. Authorities say these funds will go towards diplomacy and mediation efforts by the African Union's special envoys.
When the endowment reaches its full strength, Africa will be in a strong position to drive the continent's peace and security agenda toward the most appropriate solutions. As you know, Africa is pursuing a resolution at the United Nations Security Council to provide stable funding for African Union peace support operations. The relaunch Peace Fund is a critical piece of that architecture.
This fund would be very important because I'm saying it gives us the capacity to do the things that you need to do in order to help to advance towards silencing those guns. Sometimes you'll be short of $50,000. And the negotiating process comes to a standstill because Africa cannot produce $50,000. So, and indeed, the part of what we have to do in practice is, as facilitators, is to talk to donor countries. That's a task which we don't talk about.
Well, let's explore more on this story with senior lecturer and head of department at the School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Riara University here in Nairobi, Dr. Francis Onditi. Dr. Onditi, thank you for joining us here on the link. Now, the UN Security Council is now being chaired by China for the month of November. China has advocated for a permanent seat for Africa on the Security Council. Isn't it ironic, though, that there are discussions on peace and security issues in Africa, yet Africa itself seems unable to participate in these discussions?
Beatrice, I think participation of African countries to the United Nations Security Council, it all depends on who sets the agenda, number one. But secondly, the financial and economic muscles of countries. I mean, who contributes what? So I think if African countries would want to to participate actively, proactively on the Security Council, the first agenda is to make sure that we mobilize our resources as adequately as possible, and we should prioritize in terms of funding even some of our peacekeeping and other important activities on the continent. China might support, yes, because Chinese interest in Africa, it's growing. And, the win-win strategy that the two continents are having, China and Africa having, is something positive. If it is translated into votes at the Security Council, it can actually boost African position within the Council. But first of all, prioritization and mobilization of economic and political resources are required so that they can be respected, African states can be respected at the Council. Let's
talk about that resource mobilization you're mentioning there, because last weekend African heads of state had an extraordinary summit in Addis Ababa, and the chair, African Union chair for the year, Paul Kagame, did push for reforms to fund conflict resolution on the continent. Where will the money come from, though, to fund this African Union fund?
I think, Beatrice, we need to appreciate the, the development that have taken place at the African Union, this time round. We are seeing a lot of structural development and sometimes systemic changes taking place at the AU. Two important structures that have been developed by the heads of state. One is the Peace Fund that was rolled during the summit, but secondly, the development of the MSU, that is the Mediation Support Unit. Now, if these two structures are going to be realized or put into operationalization, I think the $4 billion that the AU requires and other resources that the AU and African states require for them to position themselves within the council, the Security Council, but also fund the activities would be something important. You'll bear with me, you'll agree with me that China is one of the largest contributor of peacekeepers to the continent. But I think in addition to that, there is a need to strengthen those two structures within the African Union so that one, they can fund themselves, but two, they will be in a position to set the agenda within the Security Council, because that is the only way the African countries are going to have their voices heard in New York.
Let's hear about Africa hearing its voices heard there, because the Security Council was formed after the Second World War. Africa has been talking about having a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It hasn't come to fruition. How relevant is it still, though, for Africa? Is it still achieving the same objectives for Africa as a continent?
I think there are two things that affect Africa, that has really delayed Africa sitting on the permanency of the Security Council. One is the domestic pressures. Africa is still grappling with a lot of economic development and security challenges, and it would be very hard to go and put fire out before you put your own fire inside. So, the domestic pressure that Africa is facing and the political will that would be required for it to even get out and provide that leadership that is required at the council. We are now past, the Cold War, where we had the major powers. Now we are talking about, multilaterally, we are talking about multipolarism, or rather where you have different powers. China is coming up, US is still powerful, but then African countries are finding positions in these two spaces. So it would be an important thing for the African states actually to really do a good job home, so that much of the resources, political effort, and mobilization can focus outside. And that is the only way we can position ourselves in the new world order.
Right, Dr. Francis Nditi, thank you for your insights.